So first, let's discuss his metaphysics. And what I'm going to be running through here is a kind of a worldview analysis. We'll look at his metaphysics, his epistemology, and so forth and so on, so we can kind of get an overview of his ideas. I entitled this chapter, Welcome to the Machine, the World as It Really Is. He sees the world essentially as a gigantic machine, if you will. It's governed by the laws of physics. It's a material world with material laws of physics governing the material world. So that is the true nature of the universe. And anyone who is a materialist in some way or another shares a great deal with him, because many things will follow from that basic view that everything is matter. And so this is ultimate reality, or the final reality. So he says, quote, "This world, a monster of energy without beginning, without end, a firm iron magnitude of force that does not grow bigger or smaller," end quote. Now, he shares with other materialists the idea that this world is made up of atoms and the void. This goes all the way back to ancient philosophy, back to before Christ, the ideas of Leucippus, Democritus, Epicurus, and Lucretius. These are ancient Greek philosophers who theorized that the world is made up of tiny little invisible spheres called atoms, unsplittables, and that these unsplittables give everything their properties. Moreover, these unsplittable little spheres are mixed in with void or nothing. And that's what makes some things, gives things their property, like their weight or their mass and so forth, okay? So it was a prescient theory. If you ever get a chance to read Lucretius's little work on the nature of things, it's just page after page of things that he's discussing here about the natural world. And it's quite prescient because he gets a lot of things right. And so this ancient view of atomism is something that is deeply, in conjunction with Nietzsche's views. So attacking theism is also a great part of Nietzsche's program and his whole attitude. He hates Christianity and he hates theism, and we will see that he also tends to dislike any type of theory or view of the world that has any transcendence in it, such as Plato, okay? So you can see why he's a thoroughgoing materialist. He doesn't want any transcendence at all. And so attacking theistic views of the universe, that the universe came from nothing ex nihilo, Nietzsche assumes a pure monistic materialism. And he holds that the material universe just is, it always has been. And up through the 19th century, most materialists believed this, even up into the 19th century, perhaps as far as up into the 1950s. But it suddenly became apparent through scientific observation that the universe started to exist at some point. Based upon background, cosmic background radiation, it became obvious that the universe had a moment of beginning. And so Nietzsche, at this time, he holds to a view that is now no longer held, the idea of a static universe that is material, like it said in the quote, a monster of energy without beginning or end, a firm iron magnitude that does not grow bigger or smaller. Okay? So, now, in philosophy, there's an old saying that either mind made matter or matter made minds. Okay? It really comes down to that. Either the material universe generates minds, or it's the opposite. A mind generates the material universe. You can see in theisms like Christianity and Islam and Judaism, a mind, God, a supreme being, makes the material world. And so Nietzsche holds the opposite, and that is that the material world just is, and somehow or another it made minds, that is our minds, okay? So there are three basic views that one can hold about metaphysics: idealism, materialism, and dualism, okay? And it's very obvious that Nietzsche is straight down the line a materialist. Now, let's talk about his statement, God is dead, as it relates to metaphysics. He is famous for saying, God is dead and we have killed him. Now, this is probably his most famous tweet or quote of all, and he assumes atheism. In other words, he doesn't try to prove that God doesn't exist. In fact, it's very difficult for atheists to do so. But there's a passage called The Madman in The Gay Science, which you will read. And in that passage, it's a story about a prophet who descends down from a mountain abode, his isolated abode, into a crowded marketplace to prophesy that God has died. Now, this prophet is probably autobiographical. This is probably Nietzsche himself, but the prophet looks a lot like Zarathustra, which is in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But anyway, this prophet comes down and announces to people that God has died and that we have killed him. And there are all kinds of consequences that lead from that, a domino effect, if you will, that leads away from the death of God. But what we need to understand here is that he doesn't believe that at one time God lived and that now, somehow or another, God died the way a biological creature would. What he means is that God is now no longer a kind of pivotal belief for civilization. God's not the hub of the wheel of civilization anymore, okay? So, the consequences that fall from this idea is that if God is dead, then also everything connected to God is dead, such as Christian morality, traditional values and traditional mores and so forth are also a sham and they need to be abandoned. Now, like I said, he doesn't believe God ever actually lived. It's kind of like Zeus. You and I, we probably don't believe that Zeus ever lived. And so we might say, well, Zeus is dead in the sense that the idea of Zeus is dead. The civilization that used Zeus as kind of like their hub for their whole wheel of their civilization is now dead, okay? And that would be the Greek civilization, right? And so that's kind of the significance of this statement. And what this leads to is a complete loss of transcendent value. There is no transcendent source for any type of value. And so what Nietzsche is saying is stop looking to a supreme being, stop looking to a God for values. And therefore, you can see all kinds of things are going to follow from this, and we're going to unpack it as we go. Nietzsche was rigorously consistent about some of the outworking of that idea. He's not rigorously consistent about everything. We're going to see how that's the case, but he is trying to rigorously work out the consequences of there being no transcendent source of value. So a lot of people today agree with Nietzsche that there is no God, atheists. Or some would say there's probably no God, the agnostics. Nietzsche takes them to the next logical step. The corresponding values of human significance based upon God must be abandoned too. And that's the rub. No final justice in the afterlife. That's one thing connected to God. There's no final justice. There's no objective good and evil. In fact, Nietzsche is going to say there simply is no such thing as good and evil, okay? There's no justice or injustice because there's nothing to define it. There's no free will and responsibility. There's no purpose or significance. People want off of this train that's called nihilism. I mean, you can see if you held to all of those ideas, no good and evil, no justice or injustice, no significance, you wind up with a nihilism. Nihil means nothing. So literally a kind of a nothingism. There is nothing to give you meaning, nothing to give you significance, nothing to define good, nothing to define evil, nothing to define justice or injustice. In fact, there's no knowledge really at all. And all you're going to be left with, according to Nietzsche, is really a will to power. But Nietzsche doesn't like this full tilt nihilism either. In fact, it's a very difficult worldview, a lifestyle to live because, well, why go on living? There's nothing to give life any significance. So he wants to escape this nihilism himself. He's followed naturalism, materialism, to its logical conclusion. and that is this nihilistic view, and he wants to escape it. He wants to somehow or another jump over that chasm of destruction. And so we'll see his solution to this human situation by and by. Nietzsche interprets Western philosophy as the Platonic tradition which Christianity successively foisted on the masses, but now as a religion. He called Christianity Platonism for the people. So Christianity and Platonism are essentially the same thing, according to him. It's just one is a philosophical version, Platonism, and one is a religious version, Christianity. Plato's ideas reach into the absolute unchanging significance, transcendent reality for significance, for knowledge, for values and morality, and so forth and so on. For Plato, there's a transcendent being, goodness, or the mind, and this transcendent reality is unchanging, permanent, perfect, and is the source of all perfections, all virtues, beauty, truth, and so forth and so on. And so there are absolute fixed values. Nietzsche says that Christianity simply echoes Platonism straight down the line, okay? And you do see some similarities there, and this is one of the reasons why there have been so many Christian Platonists through the years, most notably Augustine, probably the greatest Christian theologian since Paul. But he utterly is going to reject, this is Nietzsche's, he's going to utterly reject both Plato and Christianity. Plato's prisoner in the cave is a famous analogy that comes from Plato. In there, there's this prisoner who's chained to a wall inside of a deep, dark cavern. And down inside that cavern, he can see another wall in front of him. So that's all he can really see. And on this wall, there are shadows that dance around and move around. And that's all he knows, is the shadows on the wall deep, deep inside this dark cave. So you see the idea of darkness, and that his knowledge is of the prisoner's knowledge is of a shadowy world. Now, when he sees those shadows, he might see, like a person or, like an animal or something on the wall. According to Plato's analogy, and this all comes from Book 7 of the Republic, by the way, there's behind the prisoner, a place he can't see, a little walkway where people are walking along, and they may be carrying something on their head or on their shoulder, something like that, a little statue or something. And there's a fire that lights their path, and so it casts the shadows up on the wall. But the key thing to remember here is that the prisoner thinks the shadows are real, and he thinks that the shadows are all that really exist. And one day something really interesting happens. The prisoner's chains fall off somehow, they rust, fall off, and he escapes. And he walks out from behind the wall, and he sees the people carrying the objects that are casting the shadows up on the wall. And suddenly his whole worldview is rocked. He realizes that the shadows on the wall are not really real. And then he sees something even more amazing. He sees a shaft of light coming in down from the ceiling of the cave. And he finds a pathway up to this light, and he crawls out of the cave. The blinding light outside of the cave in the full open air in the daylight blinds him. And eventually, as his eyes adjust, he slowly begins to see the real world for the first time. He sees trees and mountains and clouds, and then finally he sees the sun itself, which lights everything. And this stupendous revelation for him, first time in his life that he's ever seen such a thing, he realizes that all of his fellow prisoners down there chained up are living a lie. They're living imprisoned in darkness. He has to go back down there and tell them the truth. He has to save them. So he goes back down into the cave to tell his friends, look, the shadows on the wall that you see are not real. They get very upset with him. They don't like this. He's upsetting their worldview now. In fact, they know everything about that shadow. They've been watching that one shadow there for 40 years. He can't tell them what they don't know. They get very angry with him, and eventually they decide to kill him because they don't want to hear it. So, clearly, this prisoner was Socrates, because Socrates was killed by the people, by the Athenians, due to his beliefs. But this analogy of the cave becomes part of the Western conscious and the Western psyche, if you will, and the part of the Western philosophical tradition. So what are those shadows on the wall? What do they really represent? They really represent the world around us. This stool, okay, for example, that chair, that table, though these are shadows. These physical things are a shadowy world in Plato. The real world, the world that is unchanging and absolute and eternal and incorruptible, is not a physical world at all. So that's where true knowledge lies. All right, why have I gone to great lengths to explain this to you? Because Nietzsche sees it the complete opposite, okay? Nietzsche is essentially telling us, stay in the cave, watch the shadows. The shadows are all that's real. This physical world is all that's real. There is no transcendent world. Plato was wrong, okay? So Nietzsche has essentially, as most materialists, flipped Plato on his head, if you will, okay? And so Nietzsche just tells us essentially, stay in the cave and watch the shadows.